Hey guys, this is Matt Hunter. I'm the founder of SaberSim. I just wanted to go through the new lineup builder and show you just some tips and processes and things that I do when I'm using it myself, just to give you guys a better idea of kind of ways that you can use the builder to get the exposures that you want, get the teams that you want, etc. So this is the main page for MLB. You'll notice all the player projections are right here. We've got the normal average projection, we've got ceiling, projected ownership, etc. You can see more detailed projections by clicking this link here. I recently added percentile projections, so if you choose from this drop down, you can see the different percentiles. So if you choose 85th, that's basically the projection that the player is expected to hit 15% of the time. This is mostly just visual, but you'll see that actually changing percentiles after we start our build can affect your exposures. So getting into the build, just a quick rundown of how it works for those that are new to the site. Basically, we build thousands of lineups in the background as part of the build. So unlike a lot of other optimizers out there where they're just creating however many lineups you request, we actually build a big pool of lineups that pull from the actual results of the simulation. And then you can adjust your exposures and your projections once that build is done and kind of filter down from that pool of lineups. So what I'll often do for a big slate like this, we've got a 10 gamer tonight, is I definitely like setting at least a 4-man stack to begin with. You can kind of just rely on correlation, but I prefer to I pretty much always want my lineups to have at least 4 players from the same team. I want 5 for almost all of them, but I like setting 4 just so I can get some exposure to the 4-4 or 4-3 lineups. That said, I'll still increase correlation because within those 4 stacks, I want the players to be correlated, and then I also want to get more 5 stacks, more 5-2, 5-3 stack lineups. Ownership is super important for MLB. For a big slate like this, you can kind of get away with playing chalkier teams, but I still really want to set this ownership pretty high, just because baseball is such a high variance sport. You really gain a lot from fading those high on players and really using that game theory to get the high upside lineups that can win the big tournaments. So variance is kind of a complicated setting in the back end, but really how it works is the higher that the variance is set, the more we're incorporating the individual simulation results into the lineups rather than just using kind of mean projections. So with the variance all the way low, you're essentially treating it more like a traditional optimizer where you're building lineups based on just the average projection. Setting variance high basically means we're using a smaller grouping of simulations for each lineup. And so that has the benefit of giving you a lot of diversification. So you're spreading out your exposures more, getting a wider player pool, but you're also incorporating the correlation more because you're using a smaller set of simulations per lineup. So if Mike Trout has a higher projection in a lineup, that will come through with the rest of the players from his game as well. So the pitcher will have a lower projection, his teammates will have a higher projection, etc. And it also helps with just increasing the upside because you'll be using the standard deviation more in your lineup, so you get players that have a higher upside compared to just their average projection. Min salary, sometimes I change this, sometimes I don't. For a big slate, I kind of like setting it fairly high. I found it just gives me a wider variety of lineups, and the lineups that I get are just higher quality because you're using up as much salary as possible, so you don't get as many of those random lineups where you have 1,000 left over and you could just upgrade a player. Especially when I have variance set high, I want to make sure that I have high quality players in all of the lineups. Obviously, I don't want to have batters versus my opposing pitcher for a slate this big. And that's pretty much it. So I'm going to kick off this run, and then I'll show you what I can do once it's complete. So while this is running, I'll kind of explain what it's doing in the background. So right now, it's kind of initializing the players, so it'll get all the players from the database, and then we're analyzing the simulation. So we're actually getting every single sim that is in the distributions database. So every player has a data point for every one of the 5,000 sims, and so we're getting all of those results and we're analyzing them in the background. And so that's why this part of the process takes a bit longer than you might expect from a normal optimizer, is because we're doing all of this work at the start. And so when we're building our lineups, we're actually building these lineups from all of these simulations that we have stored. So once this is done, analyzing the simulations, which should happen in just a second, it'll start building lineups based on those simulations. And we'll see that starting to come through now. And you'll see it happens pretty fast once we get through that first step of analyzing the sims. So you can see we've already built way more than 150 lineups. I requested 150, but already our pool is over 1,000. And so all of these lineups are kind of random sampled from the simulations themselves. So right now, it's actually sorting these 1,500 lineups by total projected points. So that's just the sum of the projection of all the players, kind of like a normal optimizer would do. There are a few ways that we can sort this lineup pool slightly differently. First, we can change the way that we're filtering. And so actually, instead of sorting by projection, we can sort by Saber score. So this is basically a way of incorporating the correlation, the ownership factor, and the upside. So all that stuff that comes from these build factors, that's what we're incorporating with Saber score. So with Saber score, you're going to see more stacks. You're going to see more ownership fades. So for example, if we sort by projection, you'll see we get way more. We're going to have 4 stack, 4 2 as the highest exposure stacks. When we sort by Saber score, our highest exposure is 5, 4 2, 5 2. So we're not getting as many of those 4 stacks with no other stacks because those are less correlated. And you'll see here as well, let's sort by projected ownership. And so you'll see when we sort by Saber score, we get 20% of the chalkiest guy, which is this cheap guy, Daza from the Rockies. When we sort by projected score, we get 53% of him. So just by sorting by projection, we're going to get a lot more of those high-owned plays. By sorting by Saber score, we're kind of utilizing the game theory aspect of DFS and fading the high-owned plays in favor of the more low-owned plays. So right off the bat, these exposures actually look really solid. And like just kind of eyeballing it here, I wouldn't necessarily want to change that much in general. If you're looking for kind of a mix of exposures that are going to lower your risk but still take advantage of leverage of the field. So you can see we have a lot of Braves hitters, but they're playing in Coors. They're not projected to be very high owned. And so that just seems like a good play right off the bat. We do have some of the chalky Rockies, especially Daza, who's a cheap guy batting leadoff in Coors. It's hard to fade him, but we're underweight because he still has a pretty high chance of failing. And we can see that if we look at his distribution, he still has 17% chance of getting around 0 points, and pretty high percentage of his distribution is around this 0 to 6 range, which is low enough that he would be a fantastic fade. So I think it's a good idea to fade him, but just to prevent the scenario where he gets 20 points and he's 40% owned, we want to have a little bit just so we're not losing everything in that situation. But it's perfectly reasonable as a strategy to just full fade him and get leverage over a big portion of the field if he doesn't do well. Looking at the team stacks, this is kind of where I spend most of my time when I'm adjusting my exposures. So here at the very beginning, we have basically the overall stack exposure for all the teams. So this is including all stack types, 2 stack, 3 stack, 4 stack, 5 stack. If we go into here, we can see the more specific exposures to stacks. So this is saying how many lineups do we have that have 5 players from the same team for each of these teams. So we have 28 lineups that have 5 Braves, 5 lineups that have 5 Padres, etc. One thing that you might want to do if you really want to get exposure to a lot of different teams is focus a lot on these 4 and 5 stack exposures. So say you don't want to have quite as much exposure to Braves, you want to have spread out your exposure a bit more. You might want to set a max exposure here of 10. And this is really cool if you're new to the new site, is when I adjust this exposure here, I get immediate results. If I change it to 5 here, it immediately updates, and now my new exposures are only 5% of the Braves 5 stacks, because we're pulling from this big pool of lineups. So I might want to say, hey, I want like 5 or 4% minimum exposure to a bunch of these different teams. And I'm going to set 4% minimum exposure to a bunch of teams. And now I have at least 6 lineups of all of these different teams with 5 stacks. So if any of these teams go off, I've got 5 or 6 lineups in all of these teams that will have a decent shot at placing highly in a tournament. So that's a good way to kind of spread out your exposure to teams, and make sure that you're taking advantage of if a team scores a bunch of runs and has high upside. I'm not going to touch the 4 stacks for now. I like the way that these look, except I'm going to lower my, so these are the different stack types just to explain what's happening here. So 4-2 basically means you have 4 players from one team and 2 players from another, and then the other 2 players in your lineup are just from 2 different teams. Generally, I want to have a lot of 5 stacks, and if I have a 4 stack, I generally want it to be 4-3 or 4-4. So I'm going to just set a 5% max exposure for these 4-2 stacks. I'm going to do the same with just 4. I don't want any. I'm just going to set a 0 here, remove all lineups that have 4 stack and just none of another. I know it doesn't sound that much different than 5, but I think it's a pretty big difference. If a team goes off for 10 plus runs, you really want as much from that team as you can. But if 2 teams go off for a bunch of runs, then you can kind of you can still do well with having the 4-3 or the 4-4. And I actually want some more 4-4 stacks. So I'm going to do this. And here we can see we finally got to the point where there aren't actually enough lineups in this pool to satisfy all of the exposure requirements that I set. So our 2 options here are just remove this requirement so I don't have to build more lineups, or I can choose to build more lineups. And so we're actually going to go back. We're going to build more lineups based on the same settings we already had. And once that's complete, hopefully we're able to get these exposure requirements right. I think part of what is actually happening here is because I set the minimum exposure for a bunch of teams for 5 stacks, I'm basically saying I need to have at least, however many teams this is, like 10 teams times 4, so that's 40% plus 20% here. That's a lot of 5 stacks, and so it's hard to force 20% 4-4 when I have that many 5 stacks. So I'm actually going to change this to 10. And then it looks like once this build is done, this should satisfy the exposure requirements. Yeah, so that's good. I think I do want more 5-3 though, if I can get that. Doesn't look like I can. In this case, it's kind of up to you what you want to do with, you can build more. One thing that you can actually do is, I'm going to just increase the correlation here and then go back. And when I hit yes, it's actually going to build my new lineups with those new settings. And so that'll just make sure that if I have the increased correlation for this new build, it's going to give me more of these 5 stacks, and that's really what I want. So I want to make sure that I have more of these 5-3, and so I don't have to have these random 4-4-2-2 stacks. So we'll wait for this to complete. And while we're doing that, I can just show you how I'm looking at pitchers. So for pitchers, it's you're not caring about stacking as much. Really, I want pitchers that have high upside, but I really care about correlation as well. Pitchers are tricky though, because it's harder to fade those really good pitchers in good spots, especially if there's not many other options. Today though, we have DeGrom as pretty clearly the chalky, expensive pitcher option. But that really makes Garrett Cole a great play, because we see that he's projected to be less than half of the ownership, but in terms of overall upside, even though he's projected 3 points less, he's still got upside for really high scores here. And I think DeGrom is probably pretty similar. Just based on the look of the distribution, I think it's a pretty similar distribution, and I'd much rather have Cole at this ownership because if he does well, you're going to get a lot more leverage. So I like the way that I got these exposures where I still have some exposure to DeGrom, but I'm more half weight, whereas I'm 3 times the field on Cole. And then I'm kind of spreading out after Cole and Greinke. I'm spreading out the exposure a lot, which I don't mind. I think you could get away with narrowing down your pitcher pool a bit more than this. For now, I think I'm just going to stick with this. I like the way that I'm getting some of these less than 10% owned pitchers in here. And I think that'll be good upside, especially if you're playing a big tournament where it's a top-heavy tournament. You really want exposure to those low ownership guys, even if they're not projected very well, like Matt Harvey. So as you can see, the new build finished. We now have 4,500 lineups in the pool, and I was able to get more of those 5-3 stacks that I wanted. Maybe you can even get more than that. We'll see if that takes. I think it might not. Yeah, so I'm just going to go back to 15, which is fine because I still am getting a lot of these good stack types. I like all these stacks. I might even go down to just, you know what, actually I'm just going to remove 4-2s. I don't really like that stack. Yeah, there we go. So removing 4-2s, and these look like really solid stack exposures. Based on these 5 stacks, I'm getting a lot of good 5 stacks, and that's pretty spread out. I might even set Cardinals a bit higher, so I'm getting, a good distribution of these stacks. 4 stacks is the same way. I'm getting a lot of pretty spread out. I think San Francisco, maybe I'll lower it a bit just to spread those exposures even more. And when we look at our batting exposures, so this is definitely very diversified, having the highest batter at 18%. But I mean, even this, I'm still 6 times over the field on Buster Posey. So if he has a big game, that's really benefiting me. And catcher is so thin anyway that I really like the fact that I'm getting a lot of leverage on these guys that Lucre has upside, Posey has upside, and they're projected low owned. The rest of my bats, I think you could go heavier on bats, but in a 10-game slate, I don't mind having my top bats at 16, 17%. I'm still, all these guys are under 10% owned, a lot of them in the 1 to 2% range. So I'm still, I'm not just right with the field on a lot of players, and I think that's enough edge for me while still reducing my risk by spreading out my bats a lot. So really, I mean, I think these exposures look great for me. This is like the type of exposures that I would want to play in a big tournament. I think you can definitely go narrower and get kind of higher exposure to the players you really like, but this is a good way to reduce the overall risk. The one thing I want to touch on, which is new as of this week, is this percentile. So what percentile does is it doesn't actually affect the build. It's going to affect the way that the projections are sorted. So if we're sorting by Saber score, even though we're not sorting by projection is still a factor in the way that we're calculating Saber score. So if I set percentile to 95, what we're going to do is it's going to increase the projection of the high upside players, and it's going to sort our lineups a lot differently. So you'll see we actually got a lot more Dansby Swanson, and I think part of that is he's batting 6. He might not have a great mean projection because there's a lot of games where he's, 26% of games where he's basically getting a 0. But he's batting in Coors, and so he has a lot of upside just because he's batting in a really good hitter's park, and he still has some power. And so by sorting by 95th percentile, we're basically isolating, when we look at this distribution, we're isolating the top 5% of his distribution. So we're isolating these points where he gets 20 plus points, and we can see that in his projection it's 23. So that's basically the point where he hits 5% of the time. And so by doing that, we're going to get more of these high upside plays. We're going to get Oakland, who are playing in Baltimore, which is a good hitter's park, especially for right-handed power. So that's why we're getting more Chris Davis. With pitchers, it's going to spread out our exposures a little bit more because pitchers, basically we're going to it's going to boost batters a little bit more relative to pitchers. So we're going to get a little bit more spread out of pitchers. We're going to get more of guys like Strasburg, who he has a lot of strikeout upside, and so he's going to have a higher percentile projection than maybe his mean would be. And I really like that. I love the Strasburg play at less than 10% owned. He's still got a ton of upside there, and great leverage with that ownership. So this is probably what I would stick with for my exposures for now. I mean, obviously I'm going to tinker, and not all the lineups are out yet. So I would adjust. If a lineup comes out, then I can always hit this refresh icon, refresh the projections, and it'll adjust, take out any players that aren't in the lineup, adjust the players based on the batting order that's changed, and give you lineups that are really solid, have upside, are diversified, and kind of use that game theory aspect of DFS that's so important. But yeah, let me know what you think. This is just kind of ways that I use the tool myself. There's plenty of different ways to use it, but I just wanted to show you some strategies that I use and how I often build my lineups.